Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or depending on where you're joining us from. In fact, while we're at it, tell us, where are you joining us from? Please, in the chat, tell us what countries that you're chiming in from today. My name is Jason Buffington from Veeam. Joining us also is Dave Russell, but Dave's in Colorado and kind of frozen in ice, or at least his pixels are. So hopefully we'll be seeing him in just a few minutes. What we're going to talk about today, we're in a four-part series. This is all part of our January New Year's resolution series. Part one, we talked about how is COVID affecting 2021 IT strategy. Part two, we talked about what are the problem statements, remember what's driving data protection change. In part three, we talked about what to look for, and a little punchline here, what to look for was often very cloudy. So we're going to talk about this week in part four, kind of wrap up this series, is the future is cloudy when it comes to data protection. Now, what we're going to cover is a little bit of data. The data that we're going to cover comes out of what will be the Data Protection Trends Report that Veeam publishes every year. Veeam uses a third-party research analyst firm, and they go out, and this year they certified 3,000 IT decision makers across 28 countries. In order to really see what's going on in that IT landscape. We believe, and Dave, you're unfrozen. The bits and the bytes have thawed. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to be here. And I like where you were going, Jason, reminding people if they haven't seen a couple of the other versions or installments of January's Industry Insights, Jason and I really do think this is the largest industry survey ever, not just 2021, but 3,000 plus pros. We've got that data by 28 different countries, global. So today we want to double click on cloud. And I know this is near and dear to your heart. I've been saying the top issues in data protection were cost, capability, complexity, pick your order. You were quick to point out last year, Jason, number 4 is cloud, isn't it?
The fourth C, baby. The fourth C has to be cloud. So let's look at the data. Between Dave and I, we've got 31 plus years each, right? So we've been doing data protection IT for really far too long. But it's not just our opinions, right? It's 3,000 other opinions. And if you bring up the first chart, our producer is in Georgia. This chart tells two really interesting stories. One, it tells the trajectory of what hybrid is going to look like in IT for the next couple of years. And it also really talks about pragmatically the effects of COVID. So let me unpack how this data works. So for the 2020 report from last year, the analyst firm asked, what percentage of your production workloads not include or were either physical servers, virtual machines, or cloud-hosted servers. And the respondent was, in fact, specifically told, don't count virtualization hosts as physical boxes. Just ignore the metal, just count the VMs inside. So we're asked what percentage lay out in each of those three kinds of topologies, and then what percentage of your environment do you think it's going to be 2 years from now? So that gives us the 2020 real and the 2022 anticipated data. We asked the same survey the next year, so now we have 2021 real and 2023 anticipated. And take a look at that curve. And actually, let's blow it back up again, because there's some nuances in this that are really important. If you look at physical servers as the example, last year they thought they were at 38% of their servers were physical, moving down towards 29, go towards that bright green. But actually, we know that COVID affected everything. COVID accelerated many digital transformation initiatives. They actually got to that 29% in 1 year, not 2 years. And the plan is they're going to keep on going down a little bit. So now it's down. Now they're going from 29 down to 24. So you're seeing that nice gentle slope. When you look at Vert, again, you see two pairs. They thought it was at 30, it was going to stay at 30. Their anticipation was flat. But no. Because of COVID, because of IT modernization, they went down to 23. And again, they think it's going to be flat, 23 going to 24. And of course, that net sum gain means that instead of being 32 on the right-hand side, going from 32 to 41, oh no, they're already up at 47 and they're moving towards 52. They're actually going to break the midpoint where more servers could be cloud hosted than on-prem. And so that's a really interesting scenario, because whatever you do in modernizing production affects how you should be modernizing protection. And that's going to be really kind of the rest of the story we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think I like how you mentioned that, Jason, because it shows the acceleration. Saying that the future is cloudy as it relates to data protection, data availability, in and of itself, of course, not surprising. But moving from a simple statement like that, moving from opinion to thousands of organizations factually saying, if you look at these bars, you have to kind of compare every other one as a pair, and then a pair on top of that. And the intention, when people said, what is my intention 24 months from now? They are moving more aggressively on that. I think you're right. I think COVID had a lot to do with that. I think the reality is, hey, this wasn't as difficult as we thought it might be. It's not taking as much time as we thought it might, and or we're receiving business results that are more in line with what we expected sooner, such that we can go faster.
One other nuance on this, nowhere on this chart does it say that the physical data center is going away, right? Let's be very clear on that, right? So still, you're talking about half of your infrastructure still being there. In fact, we don't have the chart in this version of the deck. We'll share it in February. We talk more and we double down on what cloudy futures look like. But one of the things that we actually saw in another piece of research was that the majority of workloads, and a good number of the workloads coming online in the cloud, are not migrated workloads at all. They were just, hey, when I have to spin up a new server, I spun it up in the cloud as opposed to spinning it up on-prem. And so this is not saying that the data center is going away and everyone is migrating to cloud. What it means is that the mix is going to be radically diversified, and so that all the net new workloads should be anticipated as cloud first wherever the business or the technology justifies it. So let's just put that asterisk on. The data center is no more dead than tape. Both have a long shelf life or a lifespan ahead for modern IT. So
yeah, that's a very good point. So the shift is on. The trend is definite. However, it doesn't mean people are completely decommissioning. Now, if you went down to a very small organization or an organization that was just starting out today, doesn't have prior investments, that might look very different. I did see scroll across, tell us where you're from. There's a reason for that, actually. We do track a global map of where people are saying that they're watching from in the comments. And even if you're watching beyond the live date, feel free to toss in a comment about where you're viewing from, as well as any questions or comments you might have, particularly as it relates to things going hard to the cloud or data center still in the mix. I think we've got some 13 countries right now. It's always great when some of these larger geographies, like a Russia, like a Canada, right, Jason?
I love that. Yeah, when the Canadians and the Russians both join our call, all of a sudden the whole map gets green, which is just fantastic. So and yeah, so what else we got in here? So we got South Africa, always one of my favorites, is in the house. Nicaragua is in the house. See, so looking at Europe, we got some Germany, we got some Spain. Czech Republic's down there. So, and I think, let's see what else we got. Nigeria, Romania, Saudis are in the house today. Always welcome. Let's see. Wow, there's a lot. There's what else we got? Okay, South Africa, Nigeria,
Indonesia,
the Texas
even an
education
APJ
system has failed me. I cannot pick up Nigeria out of a map. I will need to work on that.
So if we go to our next
here we go.
data point, if we double click on backup in particular, similar kind of notion, Jason, that the trend is on, right? And the trend is on, meaning going more towards cloud-based activity, but also using services-based versus self-managed. So same kind of concept here. Look at these 4 bars as pairings of every other kind of actual projected, and then this year actual, and then skipping over one of the next bars to the right would be then the projected. So not surprising on the left that self-managed backup only utilizing on-prem tools declining, in fact, declining pretty rapidly. And to your point, Jason, year over year, pretty big jump downwards, which resulted in even a greater downward trajectory for the anticipated 2 years out. But curious on your thoughts, my read on self-managed is, we're doing two things here. We're embracing the cloud, but we're also embracing a different delivery model simultaneously.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's two things that I really like about it. Certainly, as a data nerd, and I have been called that before in a loving way, the shape of this data is nearly perfect, right? What you want to see is when someone says, "Hey, I'm doing something now. This is what I'm going to plan to do 2 years, a year in. This is what I'm doing now. This is what I'm planning to do for 2 years." You want to see that nice gentle slope. You want to see those 4 bars line up. And that's what you see in actually all 3 sets of data. Is basically what it says is people had a plan. The plan includes increasing their use of cloud as part of their data protection strategy, and people are working their plan, right? That's what those 3 lines being all lined up means. Is we had a plan, the plan is cloudy, we're working the plan, right? And so you see that the self-managed only, all on-prem data protection solution goes from 40% last year, 34 this year, anticipated 22 next, down to 19. That's the way it should be. It should be a nice trajectory slope. Meanwhile, self-managed, so I'm running my own backup solution, but I'm leveraging the cloud as part of that. And certainly in Veeam speak, we're thinking that's mostly Cloud Tiers, some Cloud Connect, but it's really around leveraging the cloud as that secondary capacity repository. And then on that far right-hand side, there's a lot of people out there that just say, I want to get out of the backup business.
Right.
I would like smarter humans to operate this for me, please. And so they get the net sum gain. And so, by the way, if any of the Veeam VCSP, the Veeam Cloud Service Provider partners are out there, y'all should probably take a screenshot of that because this be your future.
Yeah, it's a very telling story. I just quickly looked up the end. I probably had some kind of translation issue importing the slide, but the N is actually 1,814. So in keeping with our multi-thousand data sample size. But you're right, Jason, directionally what this says is, people want to solve the problem. They're looking at new ways to solve the problem. In some cases because data now being born in the cloud, in other cases because they're pointing to the cloud as a repository. But while they're doing that, they're also saying, hey, I'm okay if someone comes along and does this on my behalf, so I can either redeploy my current skills elsewhere or so that I can just keep up with the availability requirements, the data growth. So totally. That's backup. Jason, why don't you take us through disaster recovery?
So anyone that knows me knows I love disaster recovery. I love the idea because when I think of disaster recovery, I don't just think about the site is underwater, the site is on fire. Anytime that you have a real server outage, you ought to be thinking about not only how fast can I stand it up, but why would I use secondary infrastructure? Why not just spin it up in a cloud? Because the cloud is surely in some language, the cloud is synonymous with elastic. And so that's where we start to get that. And so I love the idea of the cloud being a disaster recovery location. And it turns out a whole bunch of other people do too. So again, in this case, what we looked at was you got the same thing of pairings. So 2020, what are you going to do in 22? 2021, what are you going to do in 23? And in this case, the data is stacked where the darker green is organizations that anticipate doing disaster recovery by managing 2 or more self-owned data centers. So the East Coast protects the West Coast protects the East, and vice versa. But what you see in those dark green lines is that's a relatively flat percentage of the organizations. Let's see, what is it, 33, then down to... It's a little blurry on my screen. Let me bring mine up. Well, that's better. Thank you, Mark. 30 down to 28%, up to 33%, down to 32. So really right around that 30-ish% line, right? But the folks that say they're going to use cloud for their secondary capabilities, and that's really those DRaaS scenarios ideally, that goes from 23 to 30 to 38 to 51, right? And so I think there's 2 things that you see out of that. One, that where the growth is in disaster recovery is around cloud hosted infrastructure. I also love the fact that in aggregate, a significant portion of organizations, probably in response to COVID, are saying we have to do better with IT resiliency, right? So over that same 4-year curve, the aggregate goes from 54% of organizations have a DR plan up to 83% over that same 4-year period, saying we got to do better. And I love that overall. So the cloudy is the future is not only cloudy, but it's actually more resilient as well. And so kudos to all those jumping on the wagon.
Yeah, and don't you feel like part of this is because we've talked for years in the industry about kind of conflating things, meaning backup is not so discrete from disaster recovery, which is not necessarily in isolation of a migration. I mean, at the end of the day, this is all data capture, data management,
Yeah.
data movement. And if your mechanisms, your techniques, and your policy engines are very much aligned to be able to facilitate a disaster of one file versus a disaster of an entire site, then that opens up a lot of options. And I think part of what it does too, that option to your point, is it changes the way that you can actually think about who's going to satisfy and deliver this capability for you.
Totally agree with that. Yeah, at the bottom, at the end of the day, the way that modern data protection ought to be thought of is we are an ingest engine, so that we can curate a secondary copy of your data for secondary benefits. The most obvious secondary benefit is reactive. Something broke, got to get it back, right? That's restore. In a good, better, best. Next beyond that is I don't want to just push the data back. I just got to get up and running again. That's
Right.
DR. Right? And then in the best case, do something else with your data instead of just stick it in a box and wait for bad things to happen, right? So start doing data reuse, start doing data mining, and all that, by the way, takes compute. So why wouldn't you use elastic resources for it? Why wouldn't you use the cloud, right? So, I mean, there's that progression that comes out of only after you've solved for backup can you start doing things that are really more meaningful for the business? And I think that's what folks are seeing as we start conflating things like DR and DevOps and data reuse scenarios, because you now have well-curated, reliably backed up data.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And I think as this plays out over time, as we've seen actually year over year, spending, right? You certainly want from an asset management perspective to get the most out of what you've already deployed. But when it comes to net new investments, and certainly the last year, COVID-19 has made things challenging perhaps from an infrastructure refresh perspective. A lot of projects may have been maybe not canceled, but put on hold. As we saw, though, from earlier data points, digital transformation projects largely went forward. However, not all infrastructure projects went forward. So hardware refresh comes to mind. And we've chatted before about literally there were times when many of us couldn't get into the data center. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to perhaps vend out to the cloud. And even in this year, next year, when we have better economic recovery in sight, that sort of decision, it's this phrase genie out of the bottle, right? Once you sort of see that there's another way, you start looking for what other workloads, what other locations in my multinational company can I now expand this delivery model to?
Yeah, so you got the genie out of the bottle. Down in Texas, we've got the horses that are already left the barn. But however you want to look at it, you are not going to put this back in, right? So we're not going to go back to the data center. The modern data center is not defined by brick walls. The modern data center is defined by IT policy and sphere of control and delivery of service to users, right? And once you embrace that for production and for protection, then you're equipped to actually start thinking about, okay, so what does the future look like? And as we said, the future is cloudy.
So let's now look at a specific workload, Office 365, which if we think about pandemic, arguably the pandemic created different needs for organizations to communicate, and O365 adoption increased dramatically. Interesting slide here, in my opinion, because what we've often talked about in the past was the need for additional protection. Office 365, especially Exchange Online and Exchange compared to on-prem, is a great example because people already had SLAs, Jason, associated with Exchange, right? They had however many months or even longer that they wanted to be able to go back and recover from. They had certain SLAs, so it's a pretty easy comparison before and after. But you and I and others have been preaching about the need for additional protection, as you like to say, over and above the recycle bin that's innate in the solution. And that's not a knock on Microsoft. They're providing a service. You still are the custodians and owners of that data, so you still have overall governance responsibilities. But this trend year over year has been interesting in terms of whose responsibility and how they think they're going to go and solve that, isn't it?
Yeah, I love the fact that as cloud-based native platforms continue to mature, the normal IT pedigree expectations of what do you do with those platforms is finally starting to catch up a little bit. I've been telling people for years, just because you decide to use a service instead of a server does not absolve you of 7 years of retention, does not absolve you of the need for monthly and quarterly secondary iterations and previous versions of data. So that all makes sense. And what I love about this chart is it looks like people are finally kind of starting to understand this. So again, this is a year over year version. This time last year, when organizations were asked, how did you back up Office 365? Their version of backup, 69% of orgs, the green on the far left, was recycle bin. And that's down nearly 50% from 69 down to 47. And most of that headway picks up with people understanding, nearly double the number of organizations saying, yes, we know we need to do a third-party backup solution. And to your point, I think COVID has shown us that dependency on these new collaboration platforms. One of the best videos that Satya put out last year from Microsoft was in response to COVID, how many more people are embracing Teams, how many more people are putting all their critical data into this collab platform, because that is the way that they will do business moving forward. Why wouldn't you back that up?
So. Right. Yeah, and here's my take on the right side, meaning we don't currently back up with 365. You could say, oh, well, that's on the rise from 4 to 8%. But I contrast that with the middle bar, to your point, the dramatic rise in using third-party solutions. And I also contrast that with the dramatic rise in adoptions of O365, potentially first-time Office 365 embracers as well. Sure. Meaning they will likely learn and mature as their data management practice hardens, as they get more experience with the suite.
Yeah, and you can also, I'm going to read into it a little bit. I'm going to assume that those folks, the 8% of organizations that said we do not back up 365, they saw the other two options on the question, right? So they recognize that the recycle bin is not synonymous with backup, but they also know they're not using a third party. And so 8% of them said we just don't. Right. And so maybe that's because it's resilient, but they recognize that the recycle bin is not a backup. They just recognize they aren't doing anything else. And this time next year, hopefully those that answered yes now, this time next year, they've figured out and they're in the third party backup column, and all the newbies can be over on that right hand side again.
It's a good point. Awareness is step one, right? I mean, well, I guess deployment of the solution. We like to preach, if you're going to deploy the capability, deploy protection too. But that's coming from, 62 years of combined being in the backup industry. Some things are, you do things in phases, right? They're a little evolutionary. So I'm being told that we've got a few more countries in the global map. Actually, interesting. Panama, we've got Cyprus, which I think, Jason, might be a first. Not ringing a bell. If we had, apologies if we have had Cyprus in before, and Kenya in Africa as well.
Nice. US, now that's cool, because Cyprus and Kenya are both on my bucket list of places I want to go. They have been on my bucket list forever as places I wanted to visit before I stopped traveling. So hopefully when flights open up, I will go and visit each of you, and we can talk about backup or drink wine or go on safari, whichever is more relevant at the time. So.
Yeah, there might be a day where Industry Insights goes mobile.
Love that. Yes, please.
On the U.S., I know we've also got Ohio, Missouri, in addition to we have New Hampshire, Georgia, Colorado, Texas as well. So awesome. As we begin to wrap up, Jason, let's kind of do a send ahead. I think we've had a pretty good run. This 4-part series, January, looking at this initial piece of research, but we've kind of become former analysts who are now working for a vendor who have become analysts just working for a vendor, because we have so many different research projects going on. But in February, maybe give a little tease about what we want to double click on from an entirely different set of research, still oriented around protection.
Yeah, so the first research was all just looking at the data protection gamut. The next research project that Dave and I worked on together with our colleague Julie Webb was really getting, if the future is cloudy, what does that really mean? And so we looked at 5 different permutations of cloudy infrastructure that will necessitate different data protection strategies, whether it's IaaS in production, whether it's leveraging IaaS as your disaster recovery site, cloud-hosted databases on Azure and Amazon, containers, and then I'm missing one. SaaS. Yeah. How could you forget SaaS? So we looked at each of those, really looking at what were the roles that affected overall architecture, the roles that were responsible for data protection, how decisions were made as to when each kind of workload would move to different platforms. So this month we went from where 21 is going to go down to the future is cloudy. Let's spend next month looking at what does cloudy really mean. And we've also got a couple guests planned that'll kind of make February even more fun. It's good that there's 7 full weeks in the month of February, so that's going to help us with squeezing all this good content in. So,
Indeed. Well, thank you, everyone. Feel free to add more comments. We'll get back to them as soon as we possibly can. And thanks for joining. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you next month.
Take care.